Some environments ask nothing from you except that you exist within them. No performance, no translation of your internal state into something more palatable, no monitoring of how your face arranges itself when someone speaks. For certain nervous systems, this absence of demand registers as relief so profound it borders on physical. The body unclenches, breathing deepens, the mind stops running predictive simulations of social outcomes. What confuses observers is how someone can describe exhaustion after spending time with people they genuinely care about. How affection and depletion can occupy the same experience. The fatigue doesn't invalidate the connection. It reveals something about the metabolic cost of translation. Converting internal experience into external legibility requires fuel that not all systems generate at the same rate. This isn't about misanthropy, it's about recognizing that some brains process interaction the way others process intense physical exertion. The activity itself may be worthwhile. The recovery period is still non-negotiable. Neurological research on temperament suggests certain cortical patterns favor internal processing over external responsiveness. Higher resting activity in areas governing reflection, lower reactivity to novel social stimuli. Not damage, configuration. The cultural assumption remains that proper human development trends toward increased sociability. That maturity means wanting more connection, more frequently, with more people. But for some, maturity looks like finally having enough autonomy to stop pretending the standard model ever fit. They spent years believing something was incomplete in them, testing themselves against arbitrary benchmarks. How many friends, how many outings, how much spontaneous enthusiasm they could generate for plans that felt like obligations dressed as invitations. The failure wasn't in their capacity for connection, it was in accepting someone else's blueprint for what connection should require. When you build a life around compensating for your wiring rather than accommodating it, the mind begins cataloging evidence of its own insufficiency. Every declined invitation becomes proof of defectiveness. Every preference for quiet becomes something that needs justification, apology, or therapeutic intervention. The shift happens slowly, not a sudden realization, but a gradual erosion of the belief that you owe your energy to everyone who requests it, that your natural rhythms are negotiable if someone else finds them inconvenient. Some people describe this as learning boundaries, but it feels less like drawing lines and more like finally admitting which lines were always there, invisible, ignored, repeatedly crossed in the name of normal social functioning. The question that surfaces isn't whether you like people, it's whether you're willing to keep paying the cost of being available in ways your system was never designed to sustain. There's a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It emerges when your honest answer to "how are you" would require explaining an entire emotional architecture that most people don't have the reference points to understand. So you learn to translate. To convert, I find most social situations neurologically depleting into "I'm just tired." To dress up a fundamental temperament difference as a temporary condition that will surely improve with enough exposure therapy disguised as friendship, the performance becomes automatic. You show up. You engage. You deploy the energy you've reserved for this specific purpose, knowing the reserves are finite and the recovery will take days. What others perceive as participation, you experience as controlled depletion. The distortion happens in the gap between external behavior and internal cost. Someone sees you at dinner, laughing, contributing to conversation, apparently present. They have no access to the calculation happening beneath. How much capacity remains when you can reasonably leave what you'll need to cancel tomorrow to recover from tonight? The assumption that you're fine because you showed up erases the deliberate resource management required to make showing up possible. Over time, this creates a strange double consciousness. You know your actual limits. You also know that voicing them will be interpreted as dysfunction, as something requiring correction rather than accommodation. So the limits remain private. You plan around them silently. You protect them carefully. You let people believe you're simply busy when you're actually preserving the capacity to function at all. The cultural narrative insists that isolation is the problem and connection is the solution. But for some nervous systems, the math runs differently. Connection without adequate solitude doesn't create well-being. It creates a deficit that compounds until something breaks, usually the willingness to keep pretending the deficit doesn't exist. What looks like withdrawal is often the belated recognition that you've been operating at an unsustainable energy expenditure, that the version of social engagement others consider normal would, if maintained, lead to a complete depletion you can't afford. The choice isn't between connection and isolation. It's between honoring your actual capacity or continuing to perform someone else's definition of adequate participation. Some relationships don't survive that honesty. The people who valued your presence more than your well-being often reframe your boundaries as rejection. They wanted the version of you that said yes, the one that showed up tired but still showed up, the one that didn't make them question whether their expectations were reasonable. When you stop providing that version, they experience it as loss. You experience it as finally stopping a deception you never consented to in the first place. But the guilt persists because you were taught that disappointing others is a moral failure, not a resource allocation decision. That prioritizing your nervous system's needs over someone else's social preferences makes you selfish, not self-aware. The internal conflict doesn't resolve cleanly. Even when you know intellectually that you're making the right choice, some part of you keeps running the simulation where you're wrong, where everyone else understands something fundamental about human connection that you're missing, where your preference for solitude is actually avoidance wearing a sophisticated psychological justification. The doubt doesn't disappear. You just get better at distinguishing it from data. The strangest part isn't choosing to stay home, it's realizing how much of your life you've spent defending a preference that never required defense, as though the burden of proof rests on the person who finds peace in their own company rather than on the culture that pathologizes it. Somewhere in early development, many people learned that their natural state was problematic, too quiet, too inward, too content without constant stimulation. The intervention came early: play dates, group activities, gentle pressure to be more outgoing, more engaged, more like the children who seemed to need people the way they needed air. The message: your wiring is acceptable only if you're actively working to override it. So they worked. They learned to mimic social ease, to generate enthusiasm for activities they tolerated at best, to smile through overstimulation and pretend the exhaustion afterward was normal, something everyone felt but managed better. The cost of that adaptation doesn't appear on any diagnostic checklist. It shows up decades later as a bone-deep fatigue that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got, as a creeping awareness that you've built an entire life around managing other people's comfort with your temperament, as a question you don't ask aloud: how much of who I've become is authentic, and how much is just what survived the relentless pressure to be more available than my system can sustain? Some people reach a point where the performance stops making sense, not because they've given up on connection, but because they've finally calculated what maintaining it costs versus what it actually provides. The relationships built on your capacity to override your needs don't deepen when you stop overriding them. They typically just end. And that ending reveals something most people spend their lives avoiding. How many of their connections were transactional agreements to keep pretending together? You show up depleted, I won't notice. I ignore my limits, you ignore yours. We call this friendship and never examine what we're both sacrificing to maintain it. The alternative isn't better in any comfortable sense. It's more honest. Fewer people, longer stretches of solitude, a life that looks smaller from the outside and feels more sustainable from within. But the psychological cost doesn't vanish when you stop fighting your wiring. It transforms. You stop losing yourself in the performance of social adequacy. You start losing the possibility that you could have been different, more adaptable, more resilient, more capable of wanting what everyone else seems to want so effortlessly. That grief is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It lives in the gap between accepting who you are and mourning who you'll never be. The validation you seek, external confirmation that your way of being is legitimate, valuable, sufficient, rarely arrives. Most people can't offer approval for a path they fundamentally don't understand. So you stop waiting for it. You structure your life around what actually works, knowing full well that it will never look like enough to anyone operating from a different template. And the question that remains isn't whether you're living correctly, it's whether you're living honestly. Whether the peace you found in solitude is worth the isolation that comes from having that peace constantly misinterpreted as pathology. Whether you can build a meaningful life inside a preference that most of the world still treats as a problem waiting to be solved. Some people never stop wondering if everyone else knows something they don't. If the preference for home, for quiet, for internal experience over external stimulation is actually just elaborate avoidance that sounds sophisticated enough to excuse itself. The doubt doesn't resolve. You just learn to function alongside it, to build something real in the space between what your nervous system requires and what the culture insists you should want. That space is smaller than most people realize. And the question of whether you're missing something essential or finally honoring something true doesn't come with an answer you can verify outside your own experience. Just the awareness that at some point you stopped asking permission and started living like your wiring was data, not defect. If this felt uncomfortably accurate, you're probably not alone in that. There are patterns in human behavior that most people sense but never see articulated. Psychological realities that operate just below conscious awareness until someone names them. That's what we do here. If you want more explorations into the quiet mechanisms of how people actually function, the adaptations, the costs, the things we all feel but rarely discuss, subscribe. And if this particular piece landed, if it describes something you've carried without language for it, leave a comment. Sometimes the most valuable thing is knowing other people recognize the same internal landscape. More coming soon. Coming.